Before the world woke up to the headlines that would forever change history, Joe DiMaggio was already racing across the country with a secret 12-word note in his pocket, a final, desperate vow that would remain hidden from the public for nearly 40 years. Most people believe they know how the story of the Yankee Clipper and the Golden Girl ended, but the truth was buried in a velvet-lined desk drawer, waiting for the day the silence finally broke. The year is 1999, and the atmosphere in a private room in Hollywood, Florida is defined by the sterile hum of a life support monitor and the distant rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic surf. Joe DiMaggio, the man whose 56-game hitting streak became the gold standard of American excellence, lies in the twilight of his consciousness. Before the world woke up to the headlines that would alter the course of pop culture history, this man was already in motion, racing across the continental United States with a secret 12-word note tucked into the pocket of his bespoke overcoat, a desperate vow that remained a private ghost for 20 years until its discovery in a velvet-lined desk drawer after his passing. The attending physicians see a baseball icon fading into history, but Joe is mentally navigating the knowledge gap of 1962, reliving the specific sequence of events that the public was never permitted to see. The telephone in that darkened Manhattan apartment didn't just ring, it screamed with a mechanical, jagged intensity. In the early 1960s, a Western electric rotary phone possessed a specific metallic resonance that could slice through the stagnant heat of 3 a.m. New York summer. Joe DiMaggio sat upright instantly, his physiology reacting with a surge of adrenaline that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. His fingers hovered over the heavy plastic receiver, a device he had come to associate with the frantic demands of a life he could no longer control. In the absolute quiet of a Manhattan night, that sound carried the cumulative weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. He recognized the specific vibration in the air, a frequency belonging to only one person, yet a terrifying realization hung in the dark. Why was she calling now after months of tactical, icy silence? His hand, calloused from decades of swinging at high fastballs and hardened by a Sicilian pride that often doubled as a cage, shook visibly as he lifted the receiver. He wasn't the Yankee Clipper in this moment. He was a man caught in the crosshairs of a crisis he had tried to bury under a layer of stoic indifference. The public, fueled by the grainy newsreels and the black and white mythology of the sports pages, knew him only as the Man of Iron. He was the unflappable sentinel of center field, a figure of such disciplined grace that he seemed carved from the very ash of his baseball bat. Joe DiMaggio never permitted a hairline crack to show in his psychological armor. He was a man who performed his grief and his triumphs in a suit of stoic granite. For years, he had been an active participant in a self-imposed delusion, a masterful performance of moving on. He had looked the relentless sporting press in the eye and told his inner circle with a firm, final nod that the chapter of his life involving the blonde girl from 12305 Fifth Helena Drive was irrevocably closed. He had built a fortress of silence around her name, but as he pressed the cold Bakelite handset to his ear in the suffocating dark of that New York apartment, that carefully constructed persona did not just crack, it disintegrated into fine, gray dust. The void on the other end of that copper line was a vacuum of history, an empty space that Joe found himself physically compelled to fill with his own ragged breath. The voice that finally met him across those thousands of miles of wire was not the voice of a goddess. It was a whisper, a hollow, breathless rasp that made his stomach drop into a cold, bottomless abyss of realization. It was Marilyn. But the melodic, flute-like lilt that the public worshipped at the Grauman's Chinese Theater, the voice that had launched 1,000 daydreams, had been stripped away. In its place was the sound of pure clinical exhaustion, a vocalization of a soul that had been run through the gears of the Hollywood machine until nothing but a shadow remained. She dispensed with the social niceties that the studio fixers had spent years drilling into her. She offered no polite preamble, no logical explanation for the months of haunting, icy absence. She simply breathed his name, Joe. And in those 3 small letters, he heard a plea for a sanctuary that simply did not exist in the neon-lit, predatory canyons of the Hollywood Hills. He sat there in the oppressive New York heat, listening to her uneven respiration, a jagged rhythm that spoke of a heart struggling to find its pace. The ghostly static of the long-distance connection crackled in his ear, sounding to Joe like the relentless ticking of a cosmic clock, a countdown toward a midnight that no one was prepared for. He felt a sudden, violent wave of protective fury, a localized heat that originated deep in his solar plexus and radiated outward like a physical fever to his very extremities. In that silence, the what-if of their lives began to bloom. He wasn't thinking about the batting titles or the roaring crowds of the Bronx. He was suddenly submerged in the hyper-realistic tactile details of their brief, shared domesticity. He could almost smell the scent of her favorite cedar and salt soap, a clean, sharp fragrance that always seemed to ground her when the world grew too loud. He remembered the specific heavy weight of her head as she would hide her face in the crook of his shoulder, seeking the only shelter she had ever known when the panic attacks grew too intense to manage. He realized then, with a crushing absolute clarity that felt like a physical blow to his chest, that his entire legendary life had merely been a rehearsal for this specific, desperate call. This was the true ninth inning. It was his final, unscripted opportunity to be the protector she actually required, rather than the decorative, two-dimensional hero the 20th Century Fox executives expected him to play in their publicity stills. He was no longer the Yankee Clipper. He was the only man who knew the girl behind the gold. He remained on the line for hours, the cord of the telephone twisting around his calloused fingers like a lifeline. He spoke to her in a low, grounding rumble, a voice he had once used to command the outfield, now repurposed as an anchor to keep her from drifting into the dark. He told her stories of the fog in San Francisco, of the way the wharf smelled in the morning, and of the quiet life that was still waiting for her if she could just hold on. He spoke until his throat felt raw, until her erratic breathing finally stabilized, and he was certain, by the soft, rhythmic hitch in the line, that she had drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep. His mind, however, was already navigating the complex logistics of the horizon, mapping out a flight path that the world would never find on any official record. He reached into the drawer of his mahogany nightstand, his fingers brushing past the mundane objects of a bachelor's life until they found the velvet box. He had carried this object like a hidden burden, a secret weight in his pocket, since the very afternoon their divorce was finalized in 1954. It was a gold and diamond bridge back to a life they had both abandoned in a fit of mutual, stubborn Sicilian pride, a pride that now seemed like a trivial, childish thing in the face of her fading voice. He opened the box, the small light of the room catching the glint of the metal, and he knew. The fantasy was no longer a dream, it was a mission. He was going to save her, even if he had to burn the world of Hollywood to the ground. To do it. While the American public believed the legend was scouting collegiate talent in the sun-drenched ballparks of the East Coast, he was actually a silhouette moving through a private airfield in Teterboro. He boarded a twin-engine Cessna, eschewing an entourage or luggage in favor of a small leather valise and a secret that felt like a physical weight against his sternum. In the pocket of his overcoat, his fingers traced the cold, circular edges of a gold band, a ring that represented a promise he had walked away from during the height of their public volatility. As the plane climbed into the indigo clouds over the Midwest, leaving the jagged Manhattan skyline behind, he understood he was engaged in a game of inches against a ticking clock that was invisible to the rest of the world. If this rare glimpse into the private heart of a legend has moved you so far, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps ensure these forgotten moments of history reach the people who truly value them. The consistent hum of the Cessna's engines was the sole witness to the tears Joe DiMaggio finally permitted himself in the isolation of the cabin. He was acutely aware that the vultures, the studio fixers, and legal henchmen were likely already mobilizing, their black sedans turning onto the residential streets of Brentwood to reclaim a product that was no longer capable of performing. He had to arrive first. He had to reach her before the privacy he had guaranteed her was violated by the industry parasites who viewed her as a commodity rather than a sentient human being. The flight felt like an odyssey through time, each mile a stinging reminder of the years wasted in the pursuit of a career that had brought him nothing but a hollow fame. He focused on the domestic echoes of their past, the quiet breakfasts in San Francisco and the walks along the shoreline where the cameras couldn't reach them. He stared through the plexiglass at the flickering lights of the American heartland, questioning if she remained asleep or if the shadows of her depression had returned to wake her. He felt a shiver of intuition, a cold dread suggesting he was racing against a psychological darkness that had pursued her since her childhood in the Los Angeles foster care system. He wasn't flying toward a global icon. He was flying toward Norma Jeane, a woman drowning in the toxic runoff of her own celebrity. He gripped the gold ring so tightly the metal bit into his palm, creating a physical tether to a reality he refused to relinquish. He made a silent vow to the empty cabin. If he arrived in time, he would construct a barrier of total devotion around her that no politician, director, or tabloid photographer could ever penetrate. The descent into the Los Angeles basin felt like dropping into a lion's den, but Joe was a man who had performed under the greatest pressures in professional sports, and he refused to blink now. 12305 Fifth Helena Drive appeared. Deceptively tranquil from the curb, a modest Spanish colonial revival sanctuary sheltered by a wall of lush greenery. However, as Joe DiMaggio stood before the gate, he felt a localized chill that defied the warm California night. The residence was enveloped in a heavy, unnatural silence, the kind of stillness that characterizes a location when the vitality has been drained from the environment. As he pushed through the entrance, the scent of jasmine was overwhelmed by the sharp, lingering odor of car exhaust from a vehicle that had recently departed at high speed. To Joe, this wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was a fortress under siege. He stepped into the foyer, his footsteps muffled by the thick rugs, and was immediately confronted by the clutter of fame that occupied every corner of the house. There were screenplay drafts scattered across the hardwood, their pages dog-eared and stained with coffee, alongside crates of fan mail that remained sealed, a mountain of external validation that failed to provide her with a single ounce of genuine internal warmth. He traversed the living room, noting a half-empty champagne glass on a side table and a discarded silk shawl draped over a chair like a discarded skin. He recalled a specific steak dinner they had shared in a booth in 1954, the way the ambient light had hit her face and the way she had looked at him as if he were the sole occupant of the universe. That memory accelerated his pace toward the hallway leading to the master bedroom. The air within the house felt stagnant, saturated with the smell of wilted flowers and the expensive French perfume she utilized as a psychological shield. He observed the Mexican tiles she had selected with such enthusiasm, now obscured by a layer of dust that signaled a woman who had abandoned the concept of domesticity. Joe understood the value of privacy better than any man in America, but the isolation present here was of a different genus. It was the isolation of a soul that had been dissected by the public until only a whisper remained. He paused at her door, his hand resting on the wood, paralyzed by a fear he had never experienced on the diamond. He was terrified of what he would find on the other side of that threshold. He was terrified that the light he had spent his life pursuing had finally been extinguished. He closed his eyes and whispered her name, not the name on the theater marquees, but the one belonging to the girl he had vowed to protect. When the bedroom door finally swung open, Joe didn't encounter the blonde bombshell that adorned the barracks walls of a million soldiers. He saw a girl from the orphanage who was desperate to return home. She was curled on her side, a small, shivering figure eclipsed by white satin sheets that appeared like ice in the filtered moonlight. In the pale glow, her skin possessed the quality of translucent porcelain, and the golden hair that had defined a cultural era was tangled and lackluster against the pillowcase. Joe stood frozen for a heartbeat, his breath catching, realizing the goddess the world worshipped was actually a fragile spirit fading away because the industry had failed to acknowledge the human being beneath the layers of Max Factor makeup. He approached the bedside and sat down with a deliberate gentleness, the weight of his large frame causing a subtle dip in the mattress. He reached out with a trembling hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch as light as a summer breeze. Her eyes fluttered open, initially clouded by the fog of a chemically induced sleep, but then she recognized him. A small broken sob escaped her, a sound vibrating with the weight of 1,000 lonely nights and the betrayals of men who promised her the moon but delivered only shadows. "Joe," she whispered, and the phonetic sound of his name was a prayer answered at the final possible second. She made no effort to reach for her cosmetics or to adopt a cinematic pose for the phantom cameras that haunted her. She simply reached for his hand, her fingers cold and desperate as they interlaced with his. Joe leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time in his public life, the legendary silence of the Yankee Clipper was shattered by the sound of his own weeping. He articulated his apologies, regret for leaving her to face the wolves of Hollywood without his protection, and regret for the pride that had kept him in New York while she was being dismantled by the studio system. He looked at the nightstand, cluttered with empty prescription vials and crumpled tissues, and saw the horrific quantifiable cost of her celebrity. It was a tragedy, manifest in the tools she used to numb the pain of a world that consumed her image while ignoring her soul. He realized she wasn't losing her life to a single event, but to 1,000 microscopic cuts of neglect from those who only wished to possess a fragment of her legend. It's rare to find a love that stays when the lights go out. Do you believe true love like Joe's still exists in the world today? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. "I never stopped being Mistress DiMaggio," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning unit struggling against the California night. The statement hung in the air like a shimmering ghost, a confession that seemed to incinerate the last decade of tabloid scandal and public heartbreak. Joe felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been struck by a physical blow, his grip on her hand tightening as the reality of her enduring devotion became clear. For years, he had monitored her from the periphery of his own life, watching her draped in diamonds and escorted by the most powerful men in the country. never imagining that in the private corners of her heart, she was still holding a candle for the retired ball player from San Francisco. He looked into her eyes and saw a reflection of the same profound loneliness that had been his only consistent companion since their separation. It was a moment of absolute cinematic clarity where the noise of the world subsided into a dull roar, leaving only the two of them in a sanctuary of their own design. Joe realized with a crushing ache that he had been too proud to initiate the reconciliation, too preoccupied with his own ego to perceive that she was drowning in the very spotlight he had once tried to pull her away from. He looked at the scripts on the floor and the unwashed glasses, and he understood that her stardom was a cage she had been attempting to escape since the day they exchanged their vows. The dialogue between them was not concerned with the motion picture industry or the financial pressures or the third parties who had attempted to come between them. It was a fundamental conversation of the soul. He spoke of the nights spent staring at the telephone, his finger hovering over the dial, and she spoke of the way she would search for his face in every crowd, hoping to see that familiar, stoic silhouette waiting for her. They were like two vessels battered by a decade of storms, finally finding a calm harbor. Joe leaned in, his voice thick with suppressed emotion, describing a small house by the sea he had surveyed months prior, a place where the air tasted of salt and the only audience would be the gulls. He promised she would be shielded from the noise and that he would serve as a barrier against a world that treated her like a product. Marilyn reached under her silk pillow and retrieved a tattered piece of paper, the note Joe had sent her following their divorce in 1954, which she had preserved for 8 years. It was yellowed and as soft as velvet from being pressed against her heart during 1,000 lonely nights. Joe stared at the scrap of paper, his breath hitching as he recognized his own disciplined, blocky handwriting, a stark contrast to the chaotic life she had been forced to navigate. He had forgotten he had even authored it, a message sent in a moment of raw honesty before his pride had hardened into a wall of silence. Seeing it now, held in her trembling fingers, he realized that while he had been attempting to forget her, she had been using his words as her primary map back to the light. The note contained only 12 words, but they served as a tether for a soul drifting further out to sea. It read, "I will always be waiting at home for you when you're tired." Joe felt a tear track down his face, soaking into the paper as he leaned over her. Those 12 words were a promise made before he fully comprehended the depth of her exhaustion. He looked at her now, noting the dark circles and the way her frame seemed to shrink into the mattress, and the guilt he felt was a physical weight. She had been tired for years, tired of the studio contracts, tired of being a trophy for the powerful, and tired of being a legend when she only desired to be a wife. He recalled the times she had attempted to contact him over the previous year and how he had permitted the machine to answer because he feared falling under her spell again. He saw now that every time she reached out, she was verifying if the home he promised still existed. Marilyn watched him read, her eyes wide and searching for a sign that the offer remained valid. She described how she would read those 12 words before every premiere, using them as a secret shield against the flashing bulbs and the cacophony of the crowds. Even when the world insisted she was the most desired woman on earth, she only felt truly wanted when she looked at that tattered paper. It was more valuable to her than any mink coat or diamond. Joe took her hand, his thumb tracing the pale, empty space where a wedding ring once sat, and made a promise that would outlast them both. The room seemed to contract until there was nothing left in the universe but the two of them in the silver glow of a moon that felt like a spotlight from heaven. He could feel the fine bird-like bones of her wrist, a reminder of how close she had come to fading into the shadows permanently. In this moment, the man famous for his ironclad silence opened the floodgates of his heart, speaking the words he had suppressed through every lonely season. He pulled her closer until her head rested against his chest, right over the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart that had always belonged to her. Joe whispered that he was indifferent to the contracts she wanted to break or the political figures she feared. He promised to construct a fortress around her made of salt air and quiet mornings where no one would demand she be anything other than Norma Jeane. He made a final vow that night, a sacred pledge that if she would just hold on, he would spend every remaining hour of his life ensuring she never felt invisible again. He promised that even if the world continued to scream her name, he would be the one who understood her silence. Marilyn looked up at him, searching his face for any remnant of the old pride, but she found only an unshielded devotion. She asked in a whisper if he could truly love a woman who felt so broken, and Joe responded by pressing the gold ring he had carried across the country into her palm. He told her that a diamond is only beautiful because of the pressure it has endured, and that to him, she was more radiant now than she had ever been on the silver screen. They sat there for a significant time, the only sound being the ticking of the clock and their shared breathing as they mapped out a life that felt like a beautiful, impossible dream. The problem of her fame and the wolves at the door didn't vanish, but in the heat of Joe's embrace, they lost their power. As the sun began to rise over the Hollywood Hills, casting amber fingers across the bedroom floor, Joe knew he had to depart temporarily to finalize their travel arrangements before the world woke up. He stood by the window for a moment, observing the gray mist lifting from the canyon and feeling a heavy sense of forenoon dread. He turned back to the bed and saw her watching him, her face pale and beautiful in the morning light, appearing more at peace than she had in years. He didn't know then that this would be the final time he would see her blue eyes open, the last time he would hear that soft hitch in her breath as she spoke his name. He returned to her side and knelt on the floor, bringing himself eye level with the woman who had been both his greatest joy and his deepest heartache. Joe took her hand one last time, his rough fingers tracing the delicate lines of her palm as if memorizing the map of her soul. He explained that he had to return to his hotel to make the final arrangements for their departure, promising that within 24 hours they would be halfway to a new life where no one could find them. He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, a remnant of the old loneliness, and he leaned in to press a firm kiss against her forehead. "Just 48 more hours, Norma Jeane," he whispered, "and then it's just you and me against the world." The atmosphere in the room was thick with a bittersweet hope, so fragile that one was afraid to breathe. Joe surveyed the room, the discarded scripts, the half-packed suitcases, realizing they were abandoning an empire of glass for something substantial. He felt a surge of pride that he was the one extracting her, the one who had finally seen through the facade. He promised to call her every hour until his return. As he stood to leave, she caught the hem of his jacket, a desperate gesture that nearly broke his resolve. He gently unpried her fingers, gave her one last reassuring smile, and walked to the door, unaware that the clock was ticking down the final seconds of the only dream that ever mattered. A story like this reminds us that the people we see on screen are just as human as we are. Please share this video with someone who remembers this era. It's how we keep these true human moments of history alive. 3 days later, the world stopped spinning as the news bulletins shattered the Sunday morning peace. Joe DiMaggio did not weep for the cameras or the morning crowds. While the sirens wailed and the press scrambled for words to describe a tragedy that defied explanation, Joe moved through the chaos like a grieving ghost, his heart a hollow chamber of what-ifs. He refused to participate in the public spectacle or the search for a scapegoat. Instead, he did the only thing a man of honor could do when the light of his life had departed this world. He called a local florist and placed an order for 6 red roses to be delivered 3 times a week, a silent order that would remain in effect for the next 20 years. The world was clamoring for a piece of her, even in death, but Joe was determined that her final journey would be characterized by dignity. He took charge of the arrangements with a fierce authority, ensuring that no studio executives or Hollywood sycophants were permitted past the gates of the Westwood Village Memorial Park. He wanted the service to be for the girl from the orphanage, not the goddess from the screen. When the day of the service arrived, he stood by the bronze casket, his hand resting on the metal as if he could still feel the warmth of the hand he had held just 72 hours prior. He remained silent during the small service, but the look in his eyes spoke of a love refined in the fires of 1,000 heartbreaks. In the quiet aftermath, Joe began a series of secret good deeds that would remain unknown for decades. He quietly settled her outstanding accounts and ensured that those who had genuinely cared for her were provided for. He funded her mother's ongoing care and ensured her personal effects weren't auctioned off as common trinkets. He understood that true love isn't about grand gestures under a spotlight, but about the quiet protection of a legacy once the lights have gone out. Every action he took was a continuation of the conversation started in that moonlit bedroom. For 20 years, the roses arrived at the marble crypt like clockwork, a crimson testimony to a conversation only 2 people ever truly understood. While the decades rolled by and the world around her changed, Joe DiMaggio remained a man of his word, sending a message of devotion that required no signature. Each flower was a heartbeat, a reminder that the love that bloomed in Brentwood remained alive. The legend of the roses became part of American folklore, but for Joe, it was simply about a promise to a girl that she would never have to be alone in the dark again. He lived out his remaining years with a quiet dignity that baffled the tabloid reporters who circled his life. Joe never spoke her name in public and never sold the secrets of their final hours because some things are too sacred to be commodified. He carried her absence with the same grace he had carried the weight of a championship season, moving through a world that felt increasingly hollow without her. People would see him walking alone in the winter, and they would wonder what he was thinking about. They didn't know he was still sitting on the edge of that satin bed, holding a tattered 12-word note and looking into the eyes of the only woman who made him feel like a hero off the field. When Joe reached the end of his own journey in 1999, his final thoughts were not of his statistics or the Hall of Fame. Those with him at the end whispered that he looked toward a horizon only he could see, a peaceful shore where the salt air was thick and the sun was rising over a cottage by the sea. He had finished his long walk through the lonely years, and as he let go of the world, he did so with the confidence of a man who was finally going to see a familiar face. The roses stopped arriving that year, not because the love had ended, but because the messenger had finally caught up with the woman he had spent a lifetime chasing. If this secret vow between a legend and his golden girl touched your heart, please hit that like button to honor their memory and subscribe to join our community of storytellers. Every time you support this video, you help keep the true human moments of history alive. So ring the notification bell to ensure you never miss the next powerful secret from Hollywood's golden age.